Today, we're diving into a global crisis that masqueraded as trade but functioned more like economic warfare, the Opium Wars. At first glance, it's a tale about drugs, but look a little deeper, and you'll find a collision of empires, currencies, and power structures that still echo through international relations today. So here's the big question: what happens when addiction becomes policy? And more disturbingly, what happens when it's weaponized? Let's rewind to the late 1700s. Britain was obsessed with Chinese luxury goods. Think tea, silk, porcelain, items that became staples of elite British culture. But there was a problem. China didn't want much from Britain in return. So Britain was paying for these imports in silver. A lot of silver. The result? A massive trade imbalance that was draining British reserves and threatening economic stability. And that's when opium entered the picture. Britain, through its colonial holdings in India, had access to vast quantities of opium, and they found a market for it in China, whether China wanted it or not. By exporting Indian opium, Britain reversed the silver flow. Chinese silver now flowed back to British coffers. And just like that, a narcotic became an economic weapon. But here's the thesis that will guide this entire story: the Opium Wars weren't just about drugs. They were about centralized empires using trade policy as a tool of domination. This wasn't free exchange, it was forced exchange. Britain used commerce as a cover for control. And the real battlefield? It was monetary policy, economic sovereignty, and who got to write the rules of global trade. Let's dig in. Now that we've set the stage, let's talk about the economic engine behind the conflict. Because this wasn't just some shady backroom deal. It was a calculated, strategic maneuver by a global superpower. At the heart of it all was silver. Britain's appetite for Chinese goods created a silver outflow so severe, it became a national concern. Picture this: ships loaded with silver sailing east, over and over, with almost nothing coming back in return except goods that Britain couldn't produce themselves. No reciprocal trade. No balance, just loss. And when a country loses too much of its precious metal reserves, it doesn't just lose money, it loses leverage. So what did Britain do? It flipped the script using opium. By flooding China with opium, Britain reversed the silver drain. Chinese buyers, many of them addicted, paid for the drug with silver. Suddenly, the silver was flowing west instead of east. That wasn't just clever, it was cold, calculated economic warfare. A drug trade masked as market correction. But Britain didn't do this randomly. It was orchestrated through the East India Company, a private corporation with monopoly power over Indian opium. This wasn't free market chaos, it was centralized control. One entity decided what would be grown, where it would be sold, and who would profit. The company wasn't just a trader, it was a geopolitical tool. And here's the kicker: this was all part of a bigger strategy, a deliberate trade policy designed to preserve British economic dominance. Trade wasn't something that happened between equal partners. It was enforced, directed, imposed. Opium became the perfect lever, and behind that lever was the full weight of empire. Now, let's shift the focus from empire to individual, because even in the face of systemic exploitation, there are people who choose principle over profit. Enter Lin Zexu. Lin was a high-ranking Qing official, but more importantly, he was a man of moral conviction. While many within the Qing bureaucracy hesitated or turned a blind eye, Lin confronted the opium crisis head-on. He didn't just see it as a trade issue, he saw it as a national emergency, a moral failure, and a public health catastrophe. Families were being torn apart, labor productivity was collapsing, and beneath it all, addiction was rotting the social fabric of China. So what did Lin do? He didn't just complain, he took action. In one of the most remarkable diplomatic moves of the 19th century, Lin wrote a letter directly to Queen Victoria. He appealed not as a rival or a general, but as a human being. He questioned how a nation that prided itself on civility and Christian ethics could justify pushing a deadly drug on another people for profit. It was bold, it was honest, and, not surprisingly, it was ignored. But Lin didn't stop there. In 1839, he ordered the seizure and destruction of over 20,000 chests of British opium in the port city of Canton. That's not a small act of protest. That's full-scale defiance of an empire. He didn't ask permission, he acted on principle, and in doing so, Lin became a symbol of decentralized moral resistance. He represented what happens when local authority takes a stand against imperial coercion, not through violence at first, but through moral clarity. His fight wasn't just about sovereignty, it was about right and wrong. One man, one letter, one stand, against an empire armed with ships, guns, and profit motives. Lin Zexu's defiance didn't go unanswered. In fact, it triggered a violent response that exposed just how lopsided the global balance of power had become. Britain didn't just send a message, they sent warships. Armed with steam-powered gunboats and cutting-edge artillery, the British Navy was unlike anything the Qing dynasty had ever faced. These weren't ceremonial ships, they were industrial weapons. And when they arrived in Chinese waters, the playing field tilted dramatically. China's coastal defenses were outdated, their military command was fragmented, and their bureaucracy was riddled with inefficiency. The Qing dynasty struggled to coordinate a response, not because they lacked courage, but because they lacked central organization. Local governors acted independently. Communications lagged. Strategy fell apart. What Britain brought in hardware, China lacked in coordination. And so, the war was short and devastating. The result was the Treaty of Nanjing in 1842. It forced China to open 5 ports to British trade, pay large indemnities, and, perhaps most famously, hand over Hong Kong. Imagine being forced to give up your territory, your economy, and your dignity, all at the barrel of a gun. That's not diplomacy. That's coercion wrapped in the language of commerce. And that's where we get the term gunboat diplomacy, using military force to compel economic and political concessions. Trade didn't happen because both sides agreed. It happened because one side was kneeling. The First Opium War wasn't just about resolving conflict. It was about establishing dominance. Britain didn't want negotiation. They wanted access. And they took it by force. You might think one war over opium would be enough. But no, empire rarely stops at the first victory. Less than 2 decades later, Britain, and now France, returned to finish what they started. The Second Opium War began in 1856, and this time, it wasn't just about trade rights. It was about total access. Britain wanted diplomatic presence in Beijing. They wanted legal protections for missionaries. And yes, they wanted to legalize opium. Let that sink in. After flooding China with addiction, after waging a war to force open trade, Britain now demanded that the drug trade be recognized as legitimate. Not only were they pushing opium, they wanted the Chinese government to bless it. And when China pushed back, the West responded with firepower. Again, British and French troops marched inland, even reaching the gates of the capital. And in one of the most symbolic acts of imperial contempt, they looted and burned the old summer palace in Beijing. A sprawling architectural marvel, a crown jewel of Chinese civilization, reduced to ash. This wasn't just economic warfare anymore. It was cultural desecration. A message, a warning: submit or be erased. The war ended with the Treaty of Tientsin in 1858, which China was later forced to ratify after more violence. The terms were even harsher than before: more ports opened, foreign ambassadors allowed in Beijing, indemnities paid, and yes, opium trade legalized. What began as a trade dispute had morphed into full-blown imperial domination. And here's what that tells us: when empires find a successful formula for control, they double down. Coercion becomes policy, war becomes routine, and commerce becomes the cloak that hides the sword. Now we shift from the battlefield to the aftermath, because wars don't end when treaties are signed. Sometimes, that's when the real destruction begins. For China, the cost of the Opium Wars wasn't just military defeat, it was systemic collapse. Let's start with addiction. Opium didn't just poison individuals, it paralyzed a nation. Millions of Chinese people, across all social classes, became dependent. This wasn't just a health crisis, it was a workforce crisis. Productivity dropped, families were shattered, local economies deteriorated. The very spirit of the nation was being drained, one pipe at a time. But addiction was just one layer. Economically, China lost control. Foreign powers now dominated key ports. British merchants had legal protections under extraterritoriality, meaning they weren't subject to Chinese law. Imagine having your own land, your own courts, and your own laws, only to be told that a foreign power can operate above all of it. That's not partnership. That's occupation in disguise. China was also forced to pay massive indemnities. Money flowed outward while addiction flowed in. That's a 1-2 punch to national stability, financial bleeding paired with social decay. And politically, the Qing dynasty was crumbling. These weren't just foreign invasions, they were internal humiliations. The emperor's authority weakened. Local officials grew more autonomous. Rebels gained traction. All of this set the stage for future uprisings like the Taiping Rebellion, a civil war that would cost tens of millions of lives. So ask yourself, what does it take to break a civilization? Not just bombs, not just invasions, but sustained demoralization, economic disempowerment, cultural humiliation. That's what happened to China. The Opium Wars didn't just defeat China, they hollowed it out. Let's pause here, not for a history lesson, but for a reckoning. Because the Opium Wars weren't just a geopolitical conflict or an economic maneuver, they were a test of what nations will do for profit, and what they'll ignore in the process. So let's ask, what happens when trade isn't mutual, but militarized? When commerce isn't a bridge between cultures, but a battering ram. Britain claimed it was about free trade, about opening up markets, but there's nothing free about a trade agreement signed under threat of invasion. There's nothing noble about turning addiction into an economic model, and yet, that's exactly what happened. The moral question is simple, but the answer is uncomfortable. Should nations have the right to profit from the destruction of others? And if so, where does that road lead? The case of the Opium Wars reveals a contradiction at the heart of imperial economics. You can't preach liberty while practicing coercion. You can't demand open markets while closing the door on ethics. And yet, the British Empire did both. This isn't about assigning guilt to the past. It's about recognizing patterns. Because once you understand how power justifies itself, how profit sanitizes violence, and how trade becomes a tool of subjugation, you start to see echoes of the same behavior in different forms today. History isn't just facts. It's choices, it's incentives, it's consequences. And the Opium Wars force us to ask, when does trade become exploitation? And who gets to decide? Let's pull back the lens and look at the deeper systems at play, because beneath the opium and the gunboats, this was also a clash of structure. On one side, you had Britain, a centralized empire powered by a navy, a monopoly trade company, and a clear command structure. Decisions were made at the top and executed with precision. It didn't matter if those decisions were moral. They were effective, ruthless, but efficient. On the other side, China was decentralized. Local governors had authority over their own regions. The emperor was often distant, and communication across provinces was slow. In theory, it gave local leaders autonomy, but in practice, it created chaos. Coordination broke down. Responses were inconsistent, and when crisis hit, the system staggered instead of standing strong. Now, here's the paradox. Decentralization can be a strength. It allows for adaptability, local knowledge, and resilience against overreach. But when faced with a unified, aggressive opponent like the British Empire, China's fragmented structure became a liability. This contrast raises an important question: is centralization the key to winning wars, even if it compromises liberty? Or is decentralization better for preserving human dignity, even if it struggles against imperial force? Because remember, Britain's centralization made the opium system possible. A single trade policy, a single company, a single navy enforcing economic submission halfway around the world. China's decentralization couldn't stop it, but it also didn't design it. So maybe the lesson isn't which system is better. Maybe it's what those systems are used for. A centralized machine in the hands of an empire becomes a weapon. A decentralized network might fail to resist, but it also doesn't produce exploitation on a global scale. This is more than just governance. It's a reflection of values, efficiency or autonomy, control or conscience. History doesn't give us clean answers, but it does show us the cost of each path. So you might be wondering, why does any of this matter now? The Opium Wars are long over. The gunboats are gone. The treaties have faded into the archives. But the systems? The strategies? They're very much alive. What Britain did with opium wasn't unique. It was a template, a prototype for how powerful nations could use economic dependence to maintain control without needing to plant flags or build colonies. Just swap out opium for oil, or lithium, or debt. Take a look at the modern world: foreign aid tied to conditions, loans from the International Monetary Fund that come with restructuring demands, military bases that protect trade routes, sanctions that punish entire economies. These aren't declared wars, but they shape outcomes just as powerfully, and at the core, it's the same pattern: control the resource, dictate the terms, and frame it as partnership. Look at how developing nations today often export raw materials while importing debt and dependency. Look at how certain currencies dominate global markets, not because of mutual agreement, but because of historical power backed by military and financial pressure. Sound familiar? The ghost of the opium trade lives on, in modern institutions, in corporate monopolies, in the subtle coercion that replaces outright conquest. This isn't conspiracy, it's incentive, and the incentive is to maintain leverage without the cost of occupation. The Opium Wars weren't just about China, they were about how empires evolve. And the question isn't whether the West still exerts influence, it's how, and whether we recognize it. So here we are, at the end of our journey through opium, empire, and economics. And now, we're left with a bigger question, a deeper question. What kind of world do we want? Because history doesn't just show us what happened, it shows us what happens when certain choices are made over and over again, when profit is prioritized over principle, when short-term dominance erodes long-term trust, when systems built on coercion eventually collapse under the weight of their own contradictions. The Opium Wars tell us something uncomfortable: that the most powerful nations in the world, those who claim to bring civilization, order, and trade, often built their empires on addiction, force, and exploitation, and they didn't stop until they were stopped by resistance, by collapse, or by the unsustainable nature of their own designs. But it's not all bleak, because within this story, we also saw people like Lin Zexu, men who stood on principle, even when they stood alone. We saw how centralization can be a double-edged sword, how decentralization, for all its flaws, still preserves the possibility of local dignity and resistance. And we saw how economic systems shape the very fabric of freedom, or the illusion of it. So what now? Now we ask ourselves, do we build systems that rely on force, on debt, on manipulation? Or do we imagine something different? A world where trade is voluntary, where value is earned, not extracted, where strength doesn't come from domination, but from cooperation, from decentralization, from moral clarity. Thank you for watching Truth Behind History. If you found this story thought-provoking, if it made you question something you once took for granted, then like the video, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more stories that challenge the narrative and dig deeper than the textbooks ever dared. There are more histories to uncover, and more truths worth remembering.